affected. And what you see displayed here is in relation to the few years in the past, what's happening. Well, in 2011, you see a lot of red on the right end of that slide. That's the reason why people like David had to be very active in the legislative session in 2013 and work towards doing some implementation. When we talk about water in Texas, we need to quickly decide what we're talking about, either groundwater or surface water, because the rules of the road are different for the two sources. In surface water, we say that the state owns and controls that, and you can't get a permit from it for it without going to state agency in charge. Now, there are some modest exceptions to that. There's an exception for the domestic and livestock for what are relatively small lakes, and then one recently added for fish and wildlife. This is a map of the water that's beneath the surface in Texas, and in this part of the world, it's colored mostly red, and the solid red is where, when it rains on top of the surface, that it begins to percolate in the soil. That part that is slashed is routinely where the more volume is in that aquifer. The Carrizo-Wilcox is the aquifer that is prevalent in northeast Texas. When we talk about groundwater, we have a different rule of the road to surface water. In groundwater, it's fair to say that the private property owners who own the soil, absent having deeded it away, own the water beneath the land that they own. And that's limited by a groundwater conservation district's ability to make reasonable regulations of it. This is a map that shows where those oversight units of government are. You'll notice that in northeast Texas, at least Region D planning group, there are no conservation districts. So for Smith County, the county that we're in tonight, there is no restraint exercised on the private property. That means that if you own the land and are capable of withdrawing water, there's presently no restriction or limitation imposed on your wells. We need to identify the state agencies that have a primary role when we talk about implementing water strategies. The Texas Water Development Board is a banker and a planner. That's my words for it. And the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, they do the regulating of the water production. They issue water rights, and they work on making sure we're good stewards of the environment. Do we have anybody that works for the TCEQ? Anybody working for the TWDB? All right, well, both of those entities play an important function. And that graphic that you see there is the 2012 state plan. We do those plans every 5 years, and the most recent state plan is 2012. You can anticipate the next one in 2017. A moment ago, we were talking about surface water, and we decided early on that in the 1950s that we didn't have developed enough surface water. And in the 1970s, because of the drought of record that we had there, we created the Texas Water Development Board. When it started, it had $200 million worth of assets to loan out. In November, last November, we passed Proposition 6 as a state. Does anybody remember what the number that goes with Proposition 6 is? $2 billion. All right. $200 million to start out with. $2 billion in less than a year ago. And it had $6 billion before that, right? So we're talking about a state agency that in the 1950s went from being in charge of hundreds of millions to now several billion. And what difference that makes is as we get more complex, the management of those assets become more challenging. And in the early days, it was a top-down kind of thing, meaning that most of these planning, most of this implementation was thought of primarily in Austin, and it migrated out to the rural areas. Starting in 1997, we started doing something a little bit differently. In 1997, again, in response to a drought, we started with Senate Bill 1, the idea of bottoms-up planning. That meant that the state would be apportioned to various regional groups, and these regional groups would try to come up with the best plan, and then out of that regional process, we'd create a state water plan. The planning was envisioned to be on a 50-year horizon. The Texas Water Development Board is the state agency that is in primary responsibility for the plan. In the background, can anybody identify the lake that's in the background? It's my home. It's the lake it's Lake of the Pines. Lake of the Pines was built before the Texas Water Development Board began. So while Water Development Board is essential to planning, it's not the only way that projects get put together. There is a federal participation, a state participation, and a local participation that makes all of this hopefully together work together. This is a map of the various regions in Texas as the Water Development Board began in 1997, this process. The idea was, out of very diverse interests, we would come up with a stronger, better regional plan. And with a better regional plan as a foundation, we could come up with a better finished product. And you can see that of the groups that are identified there, every planning group has to have at least one member from that interest group. In our region, the Northeast Texas region, we do not have anyone representing groundwater management areas, and that's because there are no groundwater conservation districts in Region D. So that's the one exception to Region D. And when you look at that group, Region D, by number, has many more members in the agricultural interest group than in the city or the municipality group, for example.
Excuse me, could you identify the counties that are on the western edge of our district?
Okay, the counties that are on Region D's, I'll go back just a moment. The county edge for Region D, those westerly counties are Van Zandt, Hunt, and Lamar County. And Region I is referred to as East Texas. Most of Smith County is in Region I. Region C is that county, or those planning group areas that lie to the west, and predominantly is identified as the urban centers, but it does have rural areas in it.
Does Region C have Dallas and Tarrant counties in it?
Yes, they have both of those. And it basically goes all the way to the Red River. Now, in the regional planning, we're doing it every 5 years from scratch. We project population demands for the next 50 years, and from that, we predict what the demand or the need for water is going to be. And where you'll find that in is Chapter 2 of the plan. You subtract that demand from the water that you have already developed, and that's Chapter 3's number. And then when you come up with either a surplus or a need, that's described in Chapter 4. After you do the Chapter 4, you look at those strategies. In Chapter 7, there's a description of them. And in Chapter 8, you could have, let's let's say, recommendations or things that you want David and other state leaders to implement. Part of what is driving this is this graphic. You know, 100 or so years ago, Texas was very much not populated. It had a population 100 years ago of less than 5 million people. Today we're at 25 and growing. If you want to look at the 19 counties, this is our graphic for Northeast Texas. And in round numbers, we have, let me find my notes. I seem to have walked up. The graphic shows you about 762,000 population in the 2010 census, and while you can notice an upward slant to the population, it's not nearly, thank you, good. It's not nearly the upward slope that we would see for the state in general. So if you look at that population in 2010, you're going to conclude that Region D has about 3% of the population. It's projected that by 2060, that portion that resides in Northeast Texas will be declining to about 2.6 of the total. That relatively decreasing share is consistent with what happened in the last decade. When you look at this population, then what it works out to is Region D basically has the population to justify about 1 of 31 Texas senators and about 4.5 state representatives. So if you ask who are our state representatives that cover Region D, those representatives would include David Simpson, and I appreciate you being here tonight, and that's also including Representative Patty, Hughes, Lavender, and Flynn. Come January, it's anticipated that Gary Van Dieken will be representing the area that Lavender is currently representing. And I appreciate those other state representatives that are near that can identify with our concerns. This is a graphic that Tony put together for me, and I appreciate getting it because it clearly suggests that when we have drought, it's not uniformly the same all through the state. And what you see displayed is the outline of Texas color-coded by where is the drought and how bad is it. Well, what you see is in 2009, a good part of Northeast Texas in the purple, and that's the map, it's second to the right on the top. That means that we were actually wet in 2009. Everybody remember how the weather was a few years ago? We'll get back to some semblance of normalcy. And some could say that looking at that graphic in 2013, by the end of the December, much of this part of Texas was in improved condition compared to earlier in the summer of 2013. This graphic comes from the Water Development Board, and what it shows you is that solid black line that is the top of the graph. That is, if the lakes were full, this is how much water we would have. At a time when population is increasing over the last 15 years, you can see us as surface water capacity basically flatlining. I would suggest to you that path is not a sustainable path. And I've outlined in 1997 the drought that caused the water actually stored to be significantly decreasing. In round numbers, if you say we have 31 million in the surface water, in 1997 we were in the 20 million range, and that was a reason why we began trying to be more aggressive with water planning and implementation. It started with House Bill 1. House Bill 4, the product of the 2013 legislature, you can see was responding to a drought that was even more severe than the one that started Untitled 1. And that's the storage that's blue that you see shaded. That's actually how much water we have on hand at any one time. Now, in northeast Texas, the reservoirs are 76% full this month. And you can see that when we build lakes, we jump increments. We don't gradually increase. We jump, and then that's what you see by the solid line. The blue line is showing you the amount of water we actually have stored. And you can see that the weather patterns in the last decade are very much atypical. When you compare it to previous decades, that's why some of the scientists suggest that Texas, some of it, may be in its historical drought of record. For the district I work for, that drought of record was in the early 1960s. For much of Texas, that was in the 1950s. And I would suggest for those West Texas people, I think they're in their drought of record right now for the conditions they're observing. And just to repeat this message, this is Texas responding to drought. In the 1950s, we created a state agency. In 1997, we asked that state agency be more active with the local input. And in 2011, we said we got to put some money to this problem. Now, I want to talk a moment about Lake Untitled. That's the lake that I'm most familiar with. When the lake is full, it's at elevation 228.5. That lake was built in the 1950s, and you can see that the water supply pool is from elevation 201 to 228.5. Once it filled in December of 1958, it has never been more than low than what you see there at 221.91. That means that this lake is atypical. Most lakes, because of the recent drought that we were in, were anywhere from 8 to 4 feet low. And if you look at the information on other lakes within Region D, you will see a experience that's not similar to this. This is a graphic that I wanted to show you about where are those systems that are having trouble. And those systems that are having trouble are concentrated, if you want to use that word, in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, the Harris County area, and the Holliston-San Antonio area. We do have inadequacies in the country, in the rural areas, but this latest drought really exposed just how tenuous some of those urban supplies are in trying to meet demands when there's a drought. Another graphic that goes along with this concern is this one. This is the graphic that shows what population is projected to grow by in terms of percentage over the next 50 years. What I want you to see is the darker the color, the greater the growth, the predicted growth. The areas that are predicted to grow the most are the ones where the resource is stressed the worst. So we're taking a situation and accelerating the problem if we do not respond adequately to figuring out how to supply this increasing demand. You asked earlier about the counties of Dallas and Fort Worth. Fort Worth is within Tarrant County. Collin County and Denton County are those counties to their north. In 1920, I would suggest to you that rural included Denton County because its population of 35,355 was about 500 people less than a rural county in northeast Texas, Red River County. But by 1970, two of those counties had really began to expand their population. And 40 years, in the last 40 years, you can see the tremendous amount of growth that has happened in Dallas, Tarrant, Collin, and Denton.